So these days, people often ask me if being politically Black was or is my identity. And you know, that's a difficult question because all I can say is that I was part of the Black movement in the late 70s and early 80s. I never spent much time thinking about my identity. I was part of the Black movement of the time, which embraced all of us, African Caribbeans, Africans, and South Asians. And it signified our unity. We had come together to fight racism. That was the main thing. Racism was intense at the time. It's a bit like today. We were attacked on the streets, in our homes. Our children were abused and beaten up on the way to and from school. And these attacks were from the National Front or random racists. What was worse was the racism of the state, the police brutality, the constant harassment under the SUS laws, which were an earlier form of stop and search, the openly racist immigration laws with patriality clauses and dehumanizing processes like the so-called virginity tests, which were in fact sexual abuse by the agents of the state. Detention centers, which had punishment rooms, and a host of stereotypes, such as the idea that people of color were unreliable witnesses, habitual liars, in other words. And when you think of it, it was used in those days to stop children joining their mothers and splitting families apart. And it's still being used today in the context of Windrush. And then there was racism at work from our white co-workers, from employers, and even from the trade union leadership. In response, we fought back against racism on many fronts. Mothers campaigned against the SUS laws, which were being used to target their children. There were broad coalitions against racist immigration control, against virginity tests, and we won some of those struggles. In the workplaces, we set up Black solidarity actions, community support for workers, and there were iconic strikes at Wolf's Rubber Factory, Imperial Typewriters, Grunwick's, Futter's, and many other places. And one thing that many people who talk about Black these days have forgotten is that in the 50s and 60s, and even in the early 70s, the vast majority of South Asians, African Caribbeans, and Africans came here as workers. They came to rebuild the country after World War II. They were invited here to do the most unpleasant and badly paid jobs in the foundries and mills, in the health service, in the transport system. We knew back then that we had come here because colonialism had destroyed the economies in our countries. Why else would we want to come to this country? Or even if we had come thinking that the streets were paved with gold, why would we want to stay? In fact, one of the slogans of the time, coined by Sivanandan, was, "We're here because you were there." The years of colonialism were close behind us at that time. We remembered them. India won freedom in 1947, Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Jamaica and Trinidad in 1962. We knew that the strategies which the British had used in the colonies could be used against us here. Most crucially, there was divide and rule used in so many of our countries, and we were determined it would not happen here. By now, you might have guessed that we were on the left. We were the Black left, and proud to be that. We had our own leaders, not only the British Black Panthers, but people like Claudia Jones, the Trinidadian-born communist, Pan-Africanist, and feminist, who were central to so much organizing around housing, education, against racist immigration control. There was Sivanandan, who made us see that it was the state which required racism and manipulated it for our own purposes of exploitation, for its own purpose of exploitation. And John LaRose, poet and organizer, who brought us together in the Black and Third World Book Fair, and Jagmohan Joshi, who established the crucially important Indian Workers Association, which of course was also part of the Black movement, as were many purely African Caribbean organizations. But our leaders and theorists were not icons or celebrities. They were just ordinary people like us, often with many failings. And the Black movement was able to embrace many differences, debates, and contradictions. For example, struggles over gender gave rise to women's organizations. I was part of Awaz, the South Asian Women's Organization, but I was also part of OWAAD, the Organization of Women of African and Asian Descent. And the women's organizations didn't go away. We remained part of the Black movement. So how were we as a Black left different from the British, mainly white left? There were three important differences, I think. Firstly, we knew that this country had been built on the exploitation of the slave trade and colonialism. Not only cities like Bristol and Liverpool, but the totality of the Industrial Revolution in this country was fueled by the profits from slavery and colonialism. Even the NHS was set up through the exploitation of Africa. Secondly, we saw imperialism as central to any analysis of capitalism. And by imperialism, we did not mean only the fact of the British Empire, but the legacies of it, the continuing exploitation of our countries, even after independence. And thirdly, we knew that racism, colonialism, and imperialism were inextricably bound. Our history had revealed the way South Asians were targeted in the same way as Africans in the colonial period. The use of the N-word, for example, against Indians was fairly common in the early days of colonialism. Finally, we knew more than anything else that times were harsh, and to confront our oppressors, we needed unity. On an international level, it was a period of African Asian liberation, a time, as I have mentioned, when countries were winning their struggles against colonialism one by one. There was a sense of optimism, and organizations of African Asian unity were being set up. Even without the internet, we kept in touch with these events. I remember meeting women from Cuba, from South Africa, and Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it was then. International solidarity was not a duty, but something we look forward to with excitement. 1981 was a kind of turning point for the Black movement. With the uprisings of African, Caribbean, and South Asian youth against the police in Brixton, but also in Southall and elsewhere, it made the British state rethink its policies of control, particularly since a recession was also on the way at the time. Police powers were increased hugely and multicultural policies implemented. These policies were brought in the guise of meeting our demands, but although they led to many positive developments, they also created divisions. They brought funding structures which made us compete for scarce resources, and that's still happening today. This is when terms like BME and BAME were imposed on us. They were not of our own making. Today, we live in a different world. In the last 2 decades or so, racism has been reconfigured. On the one hand, racism against people of African origin has escalated hugely. On the other, fitting in with America's global strategy and the so-called war on terror, we see the growth of a raging Islamophobia. We only have to see the vitriol being poured on Shamima Begum and everyone who speaks up for her to understand this. The communities of color in this country are also different. Acute class differences have emerged among the early groups of immigrants, particularly among South Asians. There's massive unemployment in much of the north of England among South Asians, while in Leicester, workers are being exploited in prison-like conditions. At the same time, there has been the emergence of a South Asian middle class. Class differences have also emerged among African Caribbean and Africans of the early phase of immigration. And new communities have now arrived in this country. They're refugees and migrants from Africa, the Middle East, and Latin American countries. They're often the most precarious, but are engaging in some of the most inspiring workplace struggles and other struggles of today. If racism has been reconfigured, so has capitalism. We live in a time when increasingly the state's main role is to facilitate multinational corporations. Corporates run everything now, from hospital services to prisons and detention centers. There are companies like G4S, which tortures Palestinians, is increasingly involved in South Asia, and as some of us will remember, it was G4S which was implicated in the murder of Jimmy Mobenga, the Angolan asylum seeker, who was killed during a brutal forcible deportation. In this new form of capitalism, there's a fragmentation and isolation of people as individuals. Now, identity is something people think about on their own. It is often painful personal experiences, but they tend not to see these experiences in the context of wider material realities or mass movements or struggles, but through the lenses of narrow identities. This is also convenient for the market. Narrower identities can be exploited for profit as the market tailors itself to meet individual needs. But would this breaking up of solidarity and coalitions help us to fight the growing fascism of the state, the Trumpian politics of Boris Johnson? In all this, what about the shameful anti-Black racism in South Asian communities? Because despite what has been said by Barbara and Shardeen, it does exist. This has always been present, but partly as a result of colonialism and as a movement in the 70s and 80s, we constantly confronted it. Today, it has escalated enormously, heightened by the rhetoric of India's Hindu fascist government, which has spread its tentacles into the Indian community. At the same time, and for the same reason, murderous attacks on African students are taking place in India. I was a student in India once, and I know there was always a level of discrimination against Africans, but violent attacks of this sort were not known in my time. This too is linked to the rise of upper caste Hindu supremacist fascism and violence, which also targets Muslims, as well as people from oppressed castes. How should we as South Asians respond to this today? Many South Asians have felt that the answer is to self-flagellate and express guilt. But can that really work? If white guilt has never been useful, why should South Asian guilt be any different? To my mind, the answer is to stand more strongly in solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters, and to confront the racists in our community and the fascist Indian regime, which is heightening this racism. But it's not all doom and gloom. Many people who are confronting the British state on a ground level are working in solidarity. They're coming together against the hostile environment, against the surveillance of our communities through Prevent, for example. And despite everything, people are linking up in solidarity. Those fighting the fascist regime in India are coming together with activists from Kashmir, Palestine, Sudan, and other places. And then there's the emergence of the diverse Black Lives Matter movement in the UK, which is a cause for real optimism. And its clearly expressed solidarity with Palestine makes us feel there's a lot to be hopeful about.